ain't nothing like a good old running problem on a boat. And many of you have seen us use the trusty old clear hose trick for fuel troubleshooting before, where you've seen all the air bubbles in the fuel line. But we didn't really discuss the difference between what the air bubbles mean versus what an actual restriction is. And yeah, you can have both of these issues at the same time. But a restriction can actually leave you stranded if it's bad enough. All right, here we are again looking at another engine with another fuel problem. And this time, I'm gonna actually show you exactly what we're looking for and what it is. So we've got our clear hose here, and we've already determined that we've got fuel air bubbles popping here, and we've got air bubbles here at the bracket. So what we're looking for a problem with the fuel that's coming out of the fuel tank, and then it's getting to the engine. So somewhere in that line is a hole that is allowing air to get into the fuel line, which is making us run out of fuel. So now that we've got our clear hoses on there, and we can see, even looking at this, if I prime the primer bulb like this, you can see, well, now it's got, there it is, you can start to see the air bubbles. It's not a bad leak, but it is a leak. So as time goes on, you can see these, oh, look at, see all these air? This air is building up, and eventually we're gonna run out of fuel on our engine. So what we're gonna have to do is follow this pickup line here that's coming here. We're gonna need to follow that pickup over here to where the pickup is on the fuel tank, and see what is stopping it from getting fuel, as well as why it's getting air into the fuel line and feeding air to our engine, making our engine run out of fuel. Now for this exact situation, we're actually dealing with an air leak and a restriction at the same time, which is why we are running out of fuel. Generally, if you have an air leak, you will see a running problem at a higher speed, because the fuel is being mixed with air before it gets to the engine, which messes up the fuel to air ratio that is being fed to the engine. Simply put, not enough fuel. Now once the air leak gets bad enough, you can see the other side of this issue where the engine will actually run out of fuel and die. This is because the engine's fuel pump is actually trying to pull fuel from the fuel tank, but it can't pull any fuel because of the air, and eventually dies when it runs out of fuel. There are a couple of super common spots that will show you where you can have an issue, but you need to know the symptoms of the restriction problem first. Which is super easy because you just straight up run out of fuel. When you get a block somewhere in the engine's fuel line, the engine fuel lift pump can't pull any fuel because the fuel is blocked. And again, just like a massive air leak, you run out of fuel. That's what makes the clear fuel line so useful. When you can actually see the fuel or lack thereof when trying to figure out if you have an air leak or a restriction. If you have a primer bulb in the fuel line, a restriction on the boat side of the system will be a dead giveaway, because the engine fuel pump will suck the primer bulb flat and it will stay flat like this. Seeing that the engine can't pull any fuel from the line, but will be creating a vacuum sucking the primer bulb flat, whereas an air leak won't really give you this clue unless you also have a restriction in the line. Going to the engine, the most common places for an issue is going to be the fuel hose that is inside the rigging tube, as well as the fuel hose that is coming from the boat's fuel tank right before it gets to the water separator. If the hose is old enough, it can deteriorate or get cut like this. Using this hose here for an example, this hose just came apart and split in the rigging tube, causing the engine to suck a ton of air through this cut. Super common in older hoses or cheap hoses. It's not uncommon to find a restriction in the hose as well if you use some colored hoses like gray or blue, where the inside liner to the hose separates from the hose and clogs it up. We don't see too many of these anymore. Most of these types of hoses have all been done away with over the years. Now the next place for a restriction or an air leak is going to be the water separator. If the water separator is not changed regularly, it can rust out and have a hole in it, which will suck in air. Or if the filter gets clogged, it will also cause a restriction, just from being super dirty. These are some pretty common issues that you will find half of the time, and the other 50% of the issues are going to be found right here at the fuel tank pickup. Now the type of tank that you have is going to be a huge factor in how big of a deal it is to mess with when it comes to a pickup and trying to remove the pickup from the tank. You really have three materials that a boat fuel tank is made out of: with the first being aluminum, the second being fiberglass and being built into the boat, and the third being a poly tank. Now the aluminum tanks are usually the easiest to deal with when it comes to getting the pickup out of them. Because the pickup and the tank are made out of the same material, they usually come out with some elbow grease. The fiberglass tanks will usually have plates where the pickups are mounted, so you can get those out as well. Whereas our poly tanks, these can cause us some real issues. Taking our boat that we have been working on here for an example, here we have a poly tank, which is basically a plastic tank, and on the tank here is our pickup tube. Here's where the restriction and the air leak is. You can even see it, like it's hard to see in the camera. I'll try and get a close-up when I can of this pickup, but looking at our fitting here, you can see the fitting, nothing in there. But if you look real close, you can see all this white stuff right here building up inside there. So most likely there's a bunch of that stuff built up in here, and getting this fitting out is not really even an option. Here's the nut that's supposed to go around it, and that is broken off into pieces, and you can even see how corroded and broken this thing is. Somebody's already had to deal with this where they have tried to cover it in some sort of a sealant to try and get it to seal, but obviously that did not work, and therefore that thing's broken off, and you can see the pitting and the broken pieces and the corrosion all along this pickup here. So there's not really much of an option here to try and get this thing out and make it salvageable. Probably what's going to end up happening with this boat here is we're going to have to just abandon the fuel tank. Other than that, his option is to put a external tank right here and then just run the engine off of the tank that you put here and abandon this tank. To take that pickup out and put an insert in there, the labor and the chances of getting it to seal, I mean, you can see how someone's poured stuff all over this thing here, the cinder, just to try and get that to seal, and we're not 100% that that's even sealed. So unfortunately, there's our air leak and our restriction. So you can see by using our clear hoses, that's how we figured out and determined what the problem, the running issue with the fuel system is, but there's not always a really good fix for it. Unfortunately, we don't have the footage of getting the fitting out, but we actually were able to get it out with a set of vice grips and a big adjustable. We couldn't put the nut back on the fitting, so we had to use a plastic weld, and that seems to be holding for now. If it does end up leaking, they will have to go with the above the deck fuel tank like this. Also, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you can see this boat when it comes out here in a few weeks. But for now, here's the fitting and the pickup. As you can see here on the pickup fitting, it corroded all the way through, and that was where the salt was building up on the inside of the pickup, as well as allowing air to get into the system when the lift pump was working. Then here's the bottom of the pickup where there is a screen attached to the bottom of the pickup, which was actually clogged. It had a bunch of buildup around it and some stuff caked onto the inside of the screen. Also, here is a jar of the fuel that came out of the water separator after we got the pickup out and were able to pull all this junk from the bottom of the tank. I think there was a little more going on with this situation and the fuel tank. For it to be getting this much junk in it, we wanted to make sure and get as much of this stuff out of the tank as possible. But as you can see with that screen on the bottom of the pickup, all this debris and dirt would be getting sucked to the screen and causing the restriction. Usually, if you just have stuff floating around the pickup, it will float up to the top of the tank and you won't suck it up until you run the tank really low. But you might find the primer bulb won't suck shut when the lift pump turns off, because as soon as the suction stops, the stuff will float away from the pickup and allow the primer bulb to go back to normal. But it's just another aspect to look at when comparing an air leak to a fuel restriction. Don't forget to subscribe.